So the role of space, the role of levels, as we talked about it. First of all, to set the stage, to set the context, to set the boundaries, to define utilities and denials. Second, building language, specifically of those utilities, denials, and boundaries. What do they each look like? How do you go about sort of introducing those to the players? Like, what are the actions, the verbs, the objects that those verbs can act on, the nouns, the ways that we describe those nouns in order to link to verbs, being the adjectives, and the depth to those verbs, which are the adverbs. And lastly, we'll talk about variation. So let's look at a hypothetical game space. Blue triangle is your hero, and we've got some enemies over there, the red circles. So imagine we're going to have a level progression here. So start from here. Next level, we're going to add a couple of enemies. Next level, we're going to have one less, or I guess the same amount of enemies, but we're going to replace one of them with a brand new enemy, so that'll be a little bit of variation. We're going to have another of those new enemies. We're going to start increasing the amount of enemies that you have. And now we're going to introduce a third type of enemy. So the first level progressions sort of date back to the earliest days of computer games, for both now and then. The basic concept is same game, different parameters. For many early arcade games, the world's structure was static, and you'd see it on the whole screen like this. And the change in parameters between levels was pretty simple, such as game and or enemies move faster. Then they would cycle through enemy waves, different variations of composition of enemies, different types, gradually increasing composition of those enemies to progressively increase the challenge over the course of the game. Or they could add new verbs, new weapons, new power-ups, new additions to the player movement, that sort of thing. But the trouble is that there's really only so far that this type of progression can scale, however. I mean, new progressive, or new types of enemies, new art, new behaviors, new abilities for the enemies that actually are meaningful. That's pretty expensive. And additional game verbs for the player are very time-consuming to author, deciding what those verbs are, how they interact with the environment, that sort of thing. So there's a limitation there, and there's also only so much you can crank up the speed and difficulty before an arcade game like this, for instance, becomes unplayable by most people. But then again, I mean, arcade games were not really designed to sustain player attention for hours upon end. You put the quarters in, you played. Very few people spent, hours and hours on one single game. They'd move on to another game, and then eventually they'd come back to it. But that all changed with the development of home consoles. As games came into our homes, we were no longer obliged to sort of dump quarters into the machine to keep playing. We sort of expected more, longer, deeper experiences. And so the question as the developer is, how do you make games with simple mechanics last? So let's go back to hypothetical game. So I'm starting a little simpler than the environment that I showed previously in the previous iteration. So we've got a couple of enemies. The shapes are pretty simple. They're square, rectangular. Level 2, increasing the complexity a little bit, adding another enemy. Level 3, a little bit more complexity in the environment, adding a second type of enemy. Increasing enemies, more complexity. Introducing a new, I guess that's kind of rhombus, parallelogram sort of object. Increasing complexity. Adding a new type of enemy. Expanding on the sort of parallelogram, now I'm adding triangles. increasing complexity. Triangles are now interacting with the borders of the world. And, it's not that we're necessarily increasing complexity gameplay each time, but the parameters, the boundaries, and the objects in the world are making each level a different experience. And sort of the goal overall is that we increase complexity and increase challenge towards the end, but not necessarily on each level, but over the course of the game.